Hey, welcome to my booth. I'm Jay, and I had the good fortune recently to sit down with one of my friends and colleagues, the tremendously talented Nastasia Marquez. We met through an animation workshop a few years ago and just stayed in touch ever since. And we finally had the opportunity to sit down and just talk shop. So I'm going to share that conversation with you. Nastasia has been in voiceover for a little over a decade. She's worked in just about every capacity you can think of: commercial, corporate, animation, video game, audiobooks. She's done it all. And we just covered a ton of topics. We talk about how she found her way into voiceover, her time on Fiverr as a top seller. We talk about AI. We talk about the creative aspects of this business and how we maintain that creative spirit in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives. And it was just a really wonderful and refreshing conversation. So I had a blast. If you'd like to see more of this type of thing, let me know. And of course, if you want to stay up to date, you can click the YouTube buttons down there. One little note before we jump into the conversation: I was using a new recording software to get high quality video and audio for this conversation, and user error on my part, I ended up screwing up Nastasia's audio a little bit. I cleaned it up pretty well as best I could, but you may still hear some echoes and distortion at some point. I know what I did wrong. Won't happen again, but just so you know. And with that said, let's dive in. So I've known you for a while, but I don't have any idea really how your journey started
Uh-huh.
into voiceover. Because if I remember right, you didn't, this wasn't like a trajectory necessarily, right?
Yeah, it was all kind of, perhaps random, I guess. I didn't study this in college. I was on a different trajectory, and then whenever I graduated from college, I was having trouble finding a job. So, I just started experimenting and doing things like,
Mhm.
I wrote a little book, like, I tried inventing stuff. I had no idea how the world
Really?
worked. Yeah. So, voiceover was just one of the things that I picked up, and it was one of those things where if you stuck with the challenges, then perhaps that was the path I was meant to be on, so that's kind of how I started it. It was the only thing that I just kept coming back to.
In what way? Like, what specific ways did you start?
L
Cause like for me, it was I was an actor, started that whole path, but then it kind of shifted gears with the pandemic primarily, where it became like um in a similar way where it's like I just need to find something for a job, and that became sort of the path that started to stick and I kept coming back to.
Mhm.
But if there was like a specific environment that you went to, if there was like you found traction in audiobooks or something like that, something that pulled you in specifically.
Yeah, it was much more random than that. I think that tends to be more of my personality, just something like random. I enjoyed reading out loud. Like, I have a younger sister, and I would force her to let me read to her when she was little, you know? So, I had a friend who was really good at accents, and I was like, "Hey, you should be a voice actor." And he was in the military, so he wasn't, about that. And then I was like, "Hey, I should be a voice actor." So, I just kind of, I guess, started. It was about 10 years ago, so that was really before there was a lot of information out on the internet about how to get started. There
Hmm.
was really only, like, one guy, what was his name? Bill DeWeese on
Yeah, yeah,
YouTube.
yeah.
Yeah, he was the only one that I, like, really got an idea of how things worked, and then it was, the whole journey of, like, you just feel like you're digging for truffles all the
Yeah.
time, and sometime like, every once in a while, something works out for you, and you, like, hit a vein of, an approach to take, and it was just kind of like that over time.
Mm. Mm. Was there a specific job that you remember where it was like the turning point where you were like, "Oh, this feels like the fit"? Because for me, I started to book a ton of, like, meditation stuff, and that was the thing that kind of sucked me in more so.
Oh, very cool. What was the turning point? I can't quite remember. My first gig was an audiobook, and I had no idea how to structure myself, how to approach it, and as you well know, it's like a different animal in the
Yeah.
voiceover world of how to keep consistency with characters and how to build your, stamina, I guess, across a huge project like that,
Mhm.
and regulate the energy and all of that. Um, so that one was definitely like a huge mountain for me, but it paid $700 and I was like, "Wow, that's a lot of
Whoa.
money." You know? Yeah. And then I did really well on Fiverr. Like in 2020 when the world shut down, Voiceover picked up and I was so busy, 8 hours a day I was recording. And
Wow.
it was around that time where I was like, this is 100% like a full career, like making more money than I'd ever dreamed
Oh,
about
so you'd
making.
been doing it for, like, 5 years before you shifted to the full-time, this is the career thing?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was working other jobs while I was doing voiceover because I was still figuring it out. And, it's that confusing arena where you're like, I have the whole setup, but how do I find the job? So it was kind of building that up. I had no idea about agencies or managers or anything
Mm.
like that. So it was like piecing little things together over time.
So, did that sort of happen before your transition into Fiverr, or were you, like, on Fiverr as that started to pick up, you started to ask those questions about the wider industry stuff?
Yeah, I think it was that latter one. I was on Fiverr probably 2 years in. And so before that, I was really on ACX or I don't even know if it's still a platform, but Voice Bunny.
Yeah.
And then I found Fiverr and I was getting that to work, but I was figuring out how often I should be available and all of that stuff. And then at a certain point, it was that like terrifying moment of if I let go of my full-time job, will voiceover pick up enough to really equate what my income is at the moment? Because I was limiting myself on Fiverr to the hours that I was actually available. So at some point, you got to take the leap.
Right. In terms of Fiverr, because you were really successful there, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's like an interesting space because it was after I dipped in when I was first starting, but I found it just such a hard ecosystem to bust into and find a foothold that when we started talking, I was like shell shocked that you had like dominated there. And then there's also like in the wider voiceover industry, Fiverr holds like that stigma that it's Fiverr. And ever since we started talking and got to know each other, I don't know that I've ever asked you if that was something that you had to deal with or because you left recently from Fiverr, if that factored in at all, or if that wasn't even a consideration.
Yeah, it was always a stigma whenever I was on it. I guess it's called the Voiceover Alliance, where there's agents where they
Mm.
won't even talk to you if they find out that you're on any of the platforms. And what I
Oh.
learned early on is even some of the top voice actors in the industry have aliases on those platforms just because
Oh.
they've got to supplement their income and it's such a competitive industry. So it was definitely a stigma, especially on the West Coast whenever I was looking for agents. But I was making so much money and I was one of the top sellers that it was hard to let go. And I'm very like independent in how I work. So I always kind of had a chip on my shoulder of having to adhere to the specifications and the way that Fiverr functioned.
Mm.
And then you're so like shoulder to shoulder with all of the other voice actors on there that basic supply and demand of the services, it was really hard to keep the integrity of the prices as I grew.
Mm. In what way?
In the sense of, if I'm going to charge, I think at the time I was charging like $100 for usage rights, which is pretty low, based off the industry.
Categorically or per like a specific.
Just for like commercial, like I didn't even specify national versus regional,
Gotcha.
but that was the top of the bubble. Like by the end of my journey with Fiverr, I was getting a lot of pushback on my rates because everyone had undercut the rates so much that they would rather just go to someone who's just getting started and, willing to work for a couple bucks.
Mm.
So that's kind of how that journey went.
When we had talked last, you said it was partly a work-life balance thing, right? Am I misremembering it all?
At some point, I did have to really make those decisions for myself. I had never run a business before, but it was
Mhm.
hard to keep those boundaries because you never want to say no to work, especially because it comes in waves and you don't know when it's going to come again. But I was getting so burnt out at some point where I just started making, like hard boundaries of when I'm working, when I'm not working, and allowing myself to take vacation. Which, no one ever pushed back really on that stuff, and it really worked out.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's great. And in terms of your perspective now, would you do it again? Or would you, I guess, two part, would you do it again? And if there are folks like looking to get into, because that's one of the like entry points for a lot of folks, they go straight to Fiverr to start figuring it out, get a foothold. Would you say yay or nay or with caveats? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that the way I'm even starting to see the industry now is currently going through a transformation
Hmm.
that I wouldn't poo-poo on Fiverr. I'm very grateful for the start that I had on Fiverr, and it felt like a university to me where I was really able to cut my teeth and figure out what I was doing. So the experience of how to deal with clients, how to manage a workload, just working with the artistry was while I was getting paid, that's what it felt like. And that's kind of how I would pitch myself to agents,
Mm.
like as if it was almost a school for me, but I was ready for the next thing. So I think, it's hard to tell people not to get in at an easy level because what else are you going to do? Even whenever I, tell people on YouTube, like, yeah, go ahead and try and make your own demo. I have some people like reach out to me, in the comments saying, like, never make your own demo, pay a professional. And it's like, how am I going to tell someone to drop $2,500 when they're just experimenting and finding what they want? Like you got to do what's right for you and you got to do what works. So I think if people want to start on those platforms, go for it and like see if there's something to learn, and there's always that balance of like, how much are you going to invest while you're figuring out who you are in this space?
Mm. That's kind of what I tell folks as well, because I have had a very similar experience in terms of the idea of learning on the job, cutting your teeth with voices. It was kind of organic, like you described with your experience at Fiverr, where you hop in and things just start flowing and you just start learning. And after a time, you're like just uh, in the flow of things in a way. And it was very similar to how I felt about um, voices. Are you on any of the others?
No, I'm not. And now that we're talking about Fiverr, I was coaching someone and he told me that the entry for voiceovers on Fiverr is totally different than whenever I was on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
What
now
does that mean, the entry?
whenever I got on Fiverr, there were no requirements. It was like,
Yeah, like anybody can do it.
yeah, exactly. Like you could say that you did anything and then sell your service. And now he said that he went to sign up and they had him answer all of these questions about his experience, his equipment, all of this stuff, because I'm imagining they have so many people trying to enter in that they're just trying to figure out a way to, retain talent and make it worth everybody's efforts and, just kind of control that flow. So it's one of those things that since I've entered into voiceover 10 years ago, it has continuously been evolving and no one knows what's happening and everyone's just just like, trying their best.
And now with like AI and all that stuff at the frontier, we're at the precipice of another shift.
That's right. Yeah, I had a client out in Amsterdam that I work with every once in a while reach out to me yesterday asking me if they could just buy out my voice for AI for 500 bucks or they would just go find a different AI voice generator. And
$500.
and I was like
Sure, sure.
like, sell my whole business essentially. Yeah, so, they were always a really small client. I was the MC for their nightclub, and I was like, "Thank you so much for asking." But no, like, "Go find your AI generated voiceover." Yeah. It
Is
sounds a
that
little
is that
dystopian, doesn't it?
truly,
Yeah.
truly, because more and more I'll get pinged for that kind of thing because I don't know if they just do like a blanket reach out, but I've been pinged for a couple of those projects. And the agreements that because I've been like, sure, I'd love to hear purely just to see like what they're offering so I know what the landscape looks like on the inside with less of an intent of actually doing it. And the offers that some of these places put up, because I got pinged by two different stock footage type places, and both of them, the rates were for like a total without uh, basically total buyout. Now, granted, they did at least these two places have a 2-year licensing period, but the usage is just quite literally anything with the exception of like gross misrepresentations that would be like, you know, human rights violations type language.
Right.
It's crazy that some of that stuff is going on.
So how do you feel about kind of the way that your business is going to have to evolve and shape in consideration of all those different things. So many people coming into the industry and then the AI really, making a foothold.
The thing that scares me most in terms of the shifting, or the thing that I'm most concerned about in terms of the shifting, is less my own business because I feel fairly established at this point. And the thing with AI in general, uh, and we may have talked about this before, but the sort of element of the human soul, like if you listen to an audiobook and the narrator's doing the different voices and stuff like that, and it feels relational to the listener, that sort of thing feels to do it with the same fidelity that a person could just do it, a good storyteller could just tell a story. It doesn't seem like to me, and this feels very much like a knock on wood type moment, but it seems very much to me like that's the kind of thing that will always maintain the humanity. And the thing that concerns me more so is the race to the bottom, because it does, in many ways, the entire AI conversation feel like a profit over people conversation. And for some organizations or implementations, I totally get AI, where like if it's a voice assistant, that's really the only thing that it can be is an AI sort of voice like Siri. That sort of interaction needs to have that flexibility, or something if it's like helping with a disability, like a hearing device or a speech device, or someone who can't speak. If you're giving them a voice, like I would happily give
Right.
someone my voice if it helped them to communicate with the world. The things that are a race to the bottom, and I'm worried back to the competition thing and people getting in, is as people get in and like the rush that we were talking about with Fiverr and stuff like that, that people just don't know and will be taken advantage of as they're starting out.
Mhm.
And because some of these contracts, they do seem quite lucrative at face value, where they're all 5 figures plus and up to like high 6 figures. I've heard of some 7-figure contracts for AI voice cloning type stuff.
Mhm.
But for somebody just starting out, a $10,000 payout is like, whoa, holy cow. But then they own you. And then it further dilutes the rest of the stuff. And so that's kind of my thought process. How about you in terms of your business and things?
Yeah, I mean, I see AI permeating all levels where I think by the time I got off of Fiverr, they had a whole category for AI voiceover. And then, um, like I said, I had a client reach out yesterday saying that they were moving to AI, but I had a client a couple weeks ago I was introduced to that like the voiceover I did for them. So they moved off of AI to
Mm,
use, and now they want to use me in the future and they prefer the human element. And then even with agents and managers, I'll get auditions that are for AI where, in the rights it says that they're just going to recreate your voice. And it's big payouts, like $100,000 or whatever it is. But that almost feels like someone saying, hey, here's $100,000, never work in this industry again. That's how it feels a little
yeah.
bit. And so it really is everywhere. And I have been trying to think about it perhaps, like, trying to flip the coin of, like, what it could look like in a beneficial way, and it kind of I think traditionally with voice actors, we have been the last stage of a creative process. Like, what are we doing if we don't even have a script, right? Voiceover is often the last thing that they record in projects. So it has always been hard for actors and voice actors to show their stuff when it isn't in a collaborative environment because we need all of everybody else to create the stuff so then we can absorb it and then express it. And now with AI and with even how influencers are changing the industry, sometimes when I watch TV, half of the commercials are influencers that I've seen on TikTok, mixed in with actual like celebrities and stuff. And I think it kind of gives an opportunity for artists to be a little bit more of a one man band and have a little bit more vision for who they want to be.
In what way?
Um, I guess, for me throughout my career, like I've always been doing the work and things like that, but there was always like this little nagging question of like, am I expressing what I want to express? Right? It's the feeling of always waiting in line, doing audition after audition to do something that you really feel passionate about. And you're doing a lot of work that is great and you're grateful for, but it doesn't necessarily feel like the expression that you were inspired by when you got into it, if that makes sense. So, I always had that in my mind, no matter how successful I was doing, I was always like, "What is it that I'm wanting to do? What is it I'm wanting to say? Like, why like, what would give me the fulfillment of my own expression?" And I think with the way that everything's shifting, it's making that question more and more relevant. And there's plenty of people who are finding their, like, little niches to make that work, and it seems almost unstructured and unplanned for them, like influencers, they're just doing random stuff on the internet and it's blossoming into something for them. So it kind of makes me reflect a little bit more of like, well, AI is a thing, and obviously it's going to affect the industry and it's going to affect how I get work and things like that. But also, how can I find ways to leverage myself and really express myself in the world? And hopefully, through manifestation, it kind of blossoms from there.
Do you have a an idea of your why, as it were, at this point? Like what you would choose to express?
You know, only within like the last 6 months have I really started to find clarity. It's been
Nice,
years of
nice.
confusion for me. So I think it's like things are starting to come full circle where I'm very much into the spiritual space
Hmm.
and I've studied singing and tonal healing for many years. And I
Mm.
just never knew what to do with it. I would just studied that stuff and worked with my coach because that's what felt right to me. But now I'm, kind of thinking in that realm of like, how do I put these things together? And like, that is what feels really interesting to me. Like if I'm worried about the industry over here, let me like redirect my attention to something that feels exciting. And that should probably be the best direction to walk towards. So that's kind of where I am. Like, I like breath work, I like tonal healing, and I like, a cappella ethereal singing. So maybe I could
Mhm.
figure out something in that realm.
Nice.
Yeah. What about you? What do you think about, you know, utilizing all that stuff and leveraging yourself in a creative way?
It's kind of the eternal song and dance for me with this whole gig, 'cause, coming from a primarily acting background, my whole thing has always been I love to take someone's texts, see a human being within it, and, make that as colorful and full as I possibly can. And in a lot of audiobooks, that feels pretty fulfilling. The thing that's a little bit heartbreaking about that journey for me is the acting world, sort of like we've been talking about in this world. It's just so hyper competitive, and the whole influencer thing comes along, and it's so bound up. I mean, this gig too is bound up in capitalism pretty hardcore.
Mhm.
It's just a thing to reconcile, but on the acting side of things, I don't know why for me it feels easier to in voiceover, it feels easier to divorce the self implication from the things that you're doing if you uh whereas if it's your entire self, face and voice and being,
Mhm.
there's just a difference there. And that's not to say that I dislike or shun the things that I'm working on in either space necessarily, but it's just a hurdle to overcome in pretty much every single one of the things that is in that space. Anyway, all to say to the point of um, the like self fulfillment, uh, audiobooks have felt the closest thing because those are just pure storytelling in a lot of ways. And I've always had a soft spot for like kids programming in many ways. So like Mr. Rogers type stuff, Bob Ross. I used to watch a PBS thing, Pappy Druitt. Um, so maybe sometime way down the line when I've got the time and stuff, because I used to be a fine arts major. So something like that might be.
Yeah, and I think audiobook is not at all in danger of getting taken over by AI. It's just
At
too
least
long
fiction
form.
stuff.
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
see nonfiction being absorbed at some point.
That's a really good point. But it is so long form that I think it exposes the like kinks in AI a little bit too
Yeah.
much because there's so much
He
understanding of
said.
context. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a really good space, I think, to be in.
Mhm.
Hopefully, they start to get the royalties balanced out a little bit better for
Mm.
authors and everything to
Do you do a lot of royalty stuff?
No, that I did one once way in the beginning and never got a dime for it. Yeah, so but
Oh, you
then
mean royalties in general for the authors? Is that
yeah, where, like, if you work with an author, because you know how I don't know if it still is, but how they had that as an option on ACX, get paid for it or get royalties, which is
Yeah.
or never get paid for it. Yeah, so but then I learned that whenever it comes to audiobooks, like, whether it's Audible or whoever else, I can't remember who their competitor might have been, but Spotify,
Mm.
but they take, like, 70 to 85% of the royalties, and then the author has 15%, and they're not gonna wanna split that with their actor.
I don't remember the percentages, but it's definitely not in um it doesn't feel fair. We'll say that.
Yeah, that's an understatement, yeah. But I think I'm always trying to have the optimism of whoever the youngest generation is, you know?
Mhm.
I feel like young the newest generation always comes in with this idea of like, "Oh, this is just how it's always been," and they'll just find a way to make it work for them, and I think
Mhm.
every generation is like that. So I try to have the optimism of like Gen Z, where they just have like a freedom of expression where they'll just do anything. They're not going to judge themselves for it. And
Sure.
uh, so I tried to think of like, with an audiobook, like what other like avenues could I use it for? Or maybe like create a TikTok with like little, comic pictures and tell stories that way. Or I have no idea, but I'm always trying to do something weird with it.
Do you dip into social media stuff?
Yeah, I'm on I like TikTok. I have an Instagram, but I'm usually just on TikTok and then YouTube, which you and I are both on. What about you?
It's one of those spaces that I am trying.
Yeah.
But it's hard because I always, whenever I edge into those spaces, I just don't really know what to say in general because I'm the type of person. And I feel like I may have said this to you before as well. I'm the type of person where if I don't have something to say, I'm totally fine sitting in silence with another person that I don't know very well. And that's kind of how social media feels to me, where I'm like, I'm happy to just be in the room and listen to everybody else talk. And I don't feel the need to contribute to the conversation, which isn't to say that's what other people necessarily feel, but that's kind of my vibe there generally.
Yeah, that's the trickiest part for me too on any social media platform. Even when I started my YouTube channel, it was like just getting started was the hardest part,
Hmm.
of like, well, what do I say? No one's
I
asking
sat on the
me.
first couple uploads for probably like 4 months because I was like, I just don't want to do it. I don't want to do it.
Exactly. It's almost like this existential feeling of like, who am I in this space?
Totally.
Know?
And I don't know if you feel this either, but whenever because YouTube for me is easier because at least this channel it's like focused towards helping people providing a specific service, whereas Instagram and TikTok f- feel kind of different for whatever reason. And it feels like brazen self promotion whenever I go there or just talking about myself. And I'm like, nobody needs to see a picture of my omelet and stuff like that. No shame to people who do post their omelets because sometimes I like seeing people's omelets, but I never feel that need. And that I don't know why that discrepancy happens.
Yeah, and it really is like the smallest degrees of perspective that
Hmm.
shift. Like I've seen voice actors do really well on TikTok doing nothing but posting auditions because
Yeah.
people are just peeping toms. They just want to see what it looks like. And then I think then it's also there's another perspective of like whenever you're recording voiceovers, no one's thinking about you. Your voice is bridging them into an experience of something.
Hmm.
So I think one of my TikTok channels, that's kind of what I've done. I think I told you I am into astrology and stuff.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll put together little videos of like describing the mythology of Venus, and it's just something I'm interested in. So it comes really naturally because I'm studying it anyways. And then I'll pop up some like guilty of using AI like images and stuff to kind of tell the story. And then I'm like, oh yeah, if someone hired me to do this, I would be having the time of my life. So, but there's that whole difference between getting paid for something and, doing something because you
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah. That's the other thing that I find tough is when I step out, um, it's hard to switch the business brain off because that was one thing that I totally didn't understand, and partly why I made this whole YouTube channel. Because when I was starting voiceover, I didn't realize how much the small business ness of it is just like the whole thing, where you've got to be, of course, the performer, but you've also got to have some audio engineering chops at the very least. You got to have like a minimum amount. Um, then the marketing, your business structure, you're the accountant, the bookkeeper. And that whole thing got so overwhelming. Anyway, all to say for the social media stuff, it's hard for me to take off the hat where I would love to post just like something stupid on TikTok or Instagram and not think about it. But for some reason, my brain kicks into overdrive where I'm like, how is this a viable marketing thing for my business? And it's infuriating. So I just kind of shut down.
Right, and isn't that the issue? It's like everything would be so much more relaxed if we didn't have the high stakes of having to pay our bills the next month, and constantly being like chased down to like be productive financially in some kind of, way.
Yeah.
And like I'm always in the middle of that battle too. And like just like I know that they say when you forget about the money and you do what you want, the money will come. But it's very much like you feel like you're standing on a tightrope, trying your best to be like childlike and carefree and authentic without being so aware of how far you have to fall, whenever you've got to be an adult and pay stuff.
Yeah. Was there a point, because uh, was there a point in your journey in your business where that shift became more concrete or easier to take? Because the it's scary when you start saying like, I'm gonna pass on this. It doesn't feel like something I'm super interested in, but you're like, it could be like next month's rent, maybe it's a paycheck.
Yeah, and it's almost like stages of that, how at the beginning of getting into the industry, like you're not going to pass on anything. You have no idea if the next project through your door is the last one. You have no idea how to build
That
momentum.
still kind of feels that
Yeah,
way
yeah, and it really
sometimes.
maybe the next stage is the same as the first. But I think that over the past couple years, I had a lot of like big personal changes that kind of forced me out of a way that I used to be.
Mm,
And it felt like it reached me on a very spiritual level where like I got in a bad car crash, but
mm,
it was like at such a pivotal moment for me because I was on the road. I like built a mobile studio, and I was like, "Oh, this is the future. This is what I'm heading towards." Like I had this whole idea of where I was going, and then in a split second, like I was upside down, and everything was kind of out the window. And it like what all like it was like all this energy that was culminating to a certain point. It felt so uh meaningful in the way that everything played out. And then 6 months later, we got hit again by a street racer coming around a curve and just like nailed us head on. And it like both of those events reached me at such a deep level where it felt like the universe was saying something to me. And my whole life I had the kind of personality where I had to control everything and I had the mentality of like if I don't work myself to death to get to where I'm going, then I don't deserve where I'm going almost. Like I had to make it happen for myself, otherwise it was never going to happen. And I think after those two incidents, it was like a kind of long process of like unraveling that part of myself and surrendering a little bit more to flow, like not having to like, resist so much whatever energy was coming at me.
mm,
So I think now I'm like, yeah, it seems like so much stuff is happening in the industry, but like I think I'll find my way and it's better to just kind of surrender a little bit more for me than to like really try to force it to work.
mm. That sounds way healthy. Yeah. I'm sorry that it happened after that, but yeah. I think I'm coming to a similar head because my wife and I are planning to move back home for family and stuff, but also there's something about New York City in general where the amount of money here in general is crazy, and you're like rubbing shoulders with insane wealth, stuck right up against insane poverty. on a daily basis, but there's this sort of energy of the city that you feel, particularly in their entertainment industry. Well, I guess I shouldn't say particularly because it is kind of pervasive, but it just kind of pulls you along, and it's a uh, just an incessant grind that's
Yeah.
really hard to. It feels like it takes effort to resist, and I feel like it's similar in voiceover in general, where we get, at least a lot of folks that I talk to, um, I think it's a symptom of the gig work thing where, like we said, you don't know when your next paycheck's going to come. So saying no is kind of a risk built in that causes some stress. But having the, like, you do your accounting, so you see last month this was my income, so next month it must be higher, and then on an annual basis thing, there's that sort of, it feels American, that sort of, it must always grow, it must always be bigger. And I always think, is there ever a point when you just say, you know what, I think I'm doing okay and I'm going to kick it back? And in you talking, it seems like that's kind of, uh, I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but it seems like that's something that you're coming into or came into in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Um, I think as I started to like pry my hands off the steering wheel of trying to like force it to work and trying to like get somewhere and like my
Nice
big lofty
image.
goals, yeah, then I think it gave my brain some space to reorient to something that feels a bit more authentic to myself. Whenever I was like chasing so hard, there wasn't really that time to like reflect and be like, well, what do I want? It was like,
Mm,
oh, this is money, this is more money, and following that. But I think, yeah, just kind of like that really scary feeling of like, okay, I'm gonna just breathe a little bit and, like focus on myself. And then things like my energy started just growing in a different way. So now whenever I look at the work that I get, I love it and I'm so much more relaxed about it.
mm,
And then I also feel like I'm feeding different avenues of potential for myself in a way that feels more organic without any pressure of like, well, this has to be something and this has to be something. So hopefully, you kind of, as you do your move and everything like that, it'll kind of alleviate that pressure. I can only imagine like the
maybe.
pressure being surrounded by the grind to like, I imagine it's hard to unplug.
Yeah, it can be. Um, it can be, yeah. But, oh shoot, I had a thought stemming off of that. Um, oh, in terms of a like total career progression too, uh, because a question that I get asked a lot is like, where do I start? What do I do? Should I focus on specific and it runs the spectrum from people like not knowing at all where to start to having a very specific focus, like I want to do animation or I want to do audiobooks. And eh, I feel as though you and I had a similar trajectory where we kind of were just like, I'm going to give it a shot. And we kind of just cast as many lines as possible to see what stuck and then went from there. And then as things both in the world stuck where like we were talking about demos too, where I would never tell somebody to make a demo right out of the gate because you don't know what might work for you. And like I was really surprised that like e-learning and corporate stuff is a big boon of mine in terms of where I get a lot of work from. Um, and I guess I don't know what my thought or question is leading to, but it was just striking because I think now too, maybe this is it. As things progress in my own career, learning like, oh, I really enjoy this thing. And as you put more energy into that thing, a lot of stuff kind of follows and fills the gaps, as it were.
Right. And it really is like, you don't know who you are until you start doing,
Mhm.
and before that, all you have are ideas that you think sound cool and that you might want to try. And I think that's always the mentality that I had or have whenever I talk to people who are getting into the industry. People used to ask me, like, don't you feel kind of hesitant to help people get into an industry that's so competitive already? And I always had the mentality of like, throughout our lives, we're evolving and we're fluid and we're changing. There's some people who could do the same thing for 40 years and be happy, but a lot of people need to grow and evolve through different versions of themselves. So in my head, I'm like, a lot of people are going to listen to the advice and not take it, right? And that's their own sign to themselves that they aren't interested enough. They'll just keep going on their journey and listening to
Yeah.
more ideas. And then some people will take it and they'll find out that it's not for them. And then some people will take it and then they'll grow through it into another avenue of the industry, or they'll realize something about themselves with that is somehow related to this that's going to branch off into something else. Even myself, like, I never knew what was down the road, but I always had an idea of like, well, I'm also a fluid individual. At some point, I'm going to find myself in a different spot,
Mhm.
and it's just hard. It's impossible, I would say, to anticipate who you're going to be in the future. Like, anytime I had a 5-year plan, I am so far off from where that 5-year plan thought it was going to go. And the more that I tried to force it in the direction that I thought it was supposed to go, the more it, like, bit me in the butt, you know? So, I would always just had that mentality of, like, yeah, if this is something you wanna try, like, learn something about yourself, invest as little as you can so you don't find yourself down and out, but, hopefully we can help each other on everyone's respective journeys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. 100%. I could have been a quote. Um, Other things that I was curious about, because this was something that I'm kind of like I became a tech nerd as I dove into this thing. And like, I really enjoyed learning the audio engineering side of things in general. And that's not everybody's bag, but it feels as though that this whole industry, for better or worse, requires a foundational set of things that you got to have a at least basic grasp on. Did you experience that starting out? And like now, do you have like different perspectives or like a comfort level?
For sure. It was the bane of my existence for a long time. Like, I could barely understand, like, what the interface was and, like, it was such a headache for me. Um, about how many years ago? Maybe 6 years ago, I found an audio engineer on YouTube, and he's been so gracious with me, and he's made all of my presets, and now uh, I'm like one of those calculator kids, like, I cannot do the math on my own, you know? But, yeah, there's definitely the technical aspect. I think now it's so much easier because there's, like, ABCs, how to do your setup. The other issue is always soundproofing, which now that I know how it works, it is much more simple than I thought it was gonna be. But, yeah, I wish I was more of a gearhead,
No,
but
you don't.
yeah, but there's definitely, a market for people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel, in terms of the wider industry and in your business, do you feel that your level of knowledge in terms of that stuff is fine? Or do you feel like there's pressure to know more? Or do you feel like you went overboard?
Mm. No, I don't feel any pressure to know more. I know the basics, and it's almost like, you get a few hat tricks that you really just need to know about, like RMS levels and, how to make sure that your gain is correct and like how to troubleshoot some issues. And outside of that, like every once in a while I'll have an issue with like my recording software and then I have to like Google it, and kind of work through it for an hour or so. But it's just like so attainable now, and with the way that social media works, like if I don't know something, it's pretty easy to find my exact problem somewhere out there on the web. But yeah, thankfully I don't have to fuss about it so much. What about you? Do you kind of feel that pressure?
No. In fact, I think it's probably the opposite where um I have enough knowledge about that kind of thing that I think I worry too much about it at this point. And I've had some experiences where it kind of flip flops where I know enough to know what I don't know.
Mm.
So there are certain areas where I'm like, I don't know how to do this, so I'm going to leave that to somebody else. But there are a lot of areas where, like, there were a couple audiobooks or commercial projects where I sent the raw audio to the engineers working on the piece, and then I got the final product, and I was like, I sound terrible. I would have engineered this completely differently.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm caught in a place where uh and this is kind of a issue that I struggle with a lot in general is I wish that I could hand things over to people, but in the instances where I try to hand things off to people, I've had enough instances where I've been like felt let down by
Mm.
doing that at times. And so I'm just like, I'll just do it myself, which doesn't help in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. Anyway, so that thing. But in terms of the like gearhead thing, it's so easy to get bent out of shape about like which microphone's the best microphone and which one's the best and et cetera, et cetera. What's the best signal chain? And at the end of the day, none of it matters as much as you just connecting with the thing is my feeling at least.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's kind of another topic. Like, I think about that the way I think about auditions, where it's so easy to like get in your head of like, is this right or wrong? And when you speak to professionals in the industry, they give this facade as if there is a right or wrong. And they give this idea that there is a formula to success. And then once you're working in it, as you and I both know, you're like, it almost feels like playing the lottery a little bit.
Mhm.
Like the only thing that you're responsible for is doing the best that you can and being happy with your own work and then just sending it off into the ether. And
Yeah.
if something comes back, awesome. And if it doesn't, there's a million others that also didn't, and you won't remember, that
Yeah.
specific one. But I feel almost like at this point in time, even outside of the industry, it's almost like the way that we were taught things functioned is changing.
Mhm.
Like when I got out of college, I had this idea, and I had been taught this idea that you go to high school, you go to college, you get out, you get a job, and then you start making money. And then I got out of college and I graduated magna cum laude. I had 2 degrees, and I couldn't find a job. I couldn't even get a job at the Art Institute, down the road. And it was just kind of this like shocking realization that things don't quite work the way that we are taught that they do.
Mhm.
And even with YouTube, like some people don't want to give information for free because they feel like they should be paid for it, right? It's their expertise and this and that. But in a weird way, whenever you do give it for free, it finds its way back around to pay you in a different way, whether it's through credibility or exposure or just the right person seeing you and having something that's relevant to you. And I think in a global way, that is how things are starting to work more, where if you're just open and free with your expression and your authenticity and you follow something that means something to you, it will lead you to where you're supposed to be.
That feels like an awesome button.
Good, it wasn't too woo-woo for you.
No, it felt like an awesome but I mean, that's the whole reason that I started this channel in the first place is because when I was starting out, everybody it felt extortionate in a lot of ways. And on the one hand, people should be compensated for their time and expertise in many respects because it's earned in many ways. But at the same time, because this industry is in many ways like playing the lottery, and I don't think it to me feels like if you put enough in, it feels like a sieve at times where if you stick with it long enough, eventually something breaks. The issue is that part is random. When the thing breaks, who it breaks for, why it breaks, and it's just impossible to know. And it requires constant evaluation. Anyway,
Yeah.
I agree 100% that if you offer something good, then something good comes back around.
Yeah, that's a good, compressed way to say that.
Um, Before leaving, is there one thing or a couple things that you wish you, when you were starting, if you could tell yourself something that you wish you had known or when you were starting out that you would tell that version of yourself now?
Yeah, I guess it would be to not be so forceful with my vision of how things are gonna turn out. Like, make the goal, have the idea, and then once you're in it, just start going and don't insist on what the outcome's gonna look like. Yeah. Do you?
I mean, that's a pretty good one. Um,
It's probably the only one I have otherwise.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mine would probably be something along the lines of I really like um, trying before you're ready and you're better than you think you are in general. Not in terms of like a haughty, you're more talented than the other, but I have a really bad tendency to be hyper self critical. So, what that translates to is I will over prepare, be nervous going into the thing, not be as free in my expression in whatever the thing is that I'm doing. And then afterwards, hyper criticize myself on the other end of things. And yeah, try before you're ready, and you're better than you think you are, or more prepared than you think you are is probably a uh, less.
I really like that one. Yeah. I never had a problem with trying before ready, but the times where I did, like, fall on my butt with it, I would
Mhm.
really beat myself up. And looking back, I'm like, "Whatever," like,
But
it's
those moments
fine.
too, where I've fallen hard, ended up being the best, like instructive moments. Not like blanket across the thing, but most of the moments where I was flat out. I mean, honestly, the whole reason that I'm here in voiceover is because I fell down hard. Like you, I graduated, master's degree, lots of student loan debt, needed a job, pandemic hits, nobody wants me to act anywhere, and you just figure it out. And now we're here.
We're such a resilient generation.
Really, really keeps happening.
Yeah. Making lemonade over here.
Listen, I'll take some lemonade any day. Well, my friend, thank you so much for this. It was lovely to just chat with you again in general, but for just taking the time.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun, and it's always so great talking to you. I always feel so refreshed.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime.
All right.
Man, I had such a blast in this conversation. And like she just said, I always leave our chats feeling more refreshed, energized, excited to go back out and take on the world again. So I hope you feel the same. If you would like to follow Nastasia, she has a YouTube channel of her own. I'll link it below, and she also is on Instagram and TikTok, as she said, a couple channels there. I'll link those as well down below. And if you would like to see more of this stuff, then let me know. You can follow along by clicking the buttons here, and I'll set more of these up because I truly had such a fun time. And until the next one of these, be well, everybody, and I will see you there. Toodles.